Righto, today's little project, got the Norco, a little bit dirty. It's been raining, it's been pouring where I am. Massive east coast low, almost drowned us last night. Anyway, I'm going to change. I'm going away doing a mountain biking trip in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to give this a quick wash, and then I'm going to take all the bearings off the back of my Sight C2, this glorious Norco that I'm getting used to, and try and get rid of any squeaks and rattles out of the back end, because there is a bit of a squeak, and I'm pretty sure it's coming from this rear geometry. So, got a torque wrench, and we'll go from there. Righto, first step, make sure that your bike is in the lowest gear. If you've got a clutch on your rear derailleur, take the clutch off, otherwise you won't be able to swing that forward. And I'm going to take the wheel off and see if I can access these bearings. So, oh, listen to that I9 hub. So, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is going to mean the chainring has got to come off as well. Times by 2 is 10, so a lot of work to do. Well, the only thing you are going to have to do is to take off any quick links, because you're going to have to pop the chain off, because I know that I've got to get the chainring off. There we go, one chain. So what I've done, just as a bit of a cheat guide, is I've sketched a representation of the back of the suspension. Yeah, it's pretty crap, but it'll do, so I can basically denote where the bearings go when I pull them out. So number one. Okay, so I'm going to pull the first bearing out, and I expect there'll be some shims in here. And yeah, there we go. So we've got one O-ring and then one slightly recessed at the back. Now there's a fair bit of crap on these. This is really what I'm primarily trying to clear out. So what you need to make note of is you've got a fat O-ring or a fat shim and a thin shim. The fat shim goes on the inside, the thin shim goes on the outside. So basically there's a recess at the back of this bearing here that accepts this fatter shim. So take note of that. When you put them for storage, store them so that they're going to they're stored in the position that they go back in. Now I had a little thought. I thought surely Norco is an experienced company, surely they would have details of different torques for different parts of the bike, and sure enough they do. So this, I'll put a link to this. This is the pivot that we just took apart, and you can see that the fatter part number 25 goes on the inside, and the thinner part 24 goes on the outside. So everything's very self-explanatory, and they've got a much better parts diagram than my dodgy sketch over here, but I had to start with something. So that's my parts diagram, and critically here are all the torques. So that's what I'll be using when I use my torque wrench when everything's cleaned and done. So I'm going to basically duplicate this method on all the bearings. I've given this one a bit of a clean already. Just taking a crappy old rag, just getting in there, giving everything a solid clean. I'll give it a light re-grease before I reassemble, keeping note of the position of the fat and the thin spaces and where they go, and critically the torques. But the other thing that you want to do is, with these bearings, I don't have a bearing puller, and I'm not going to bash them out to replace them, because I'm not replacing them. The bike's only a couple of years old. But what I am going to do is I'm just going to use my finger and rotate, and this bearing feels very stiff. So I'm just going to make sure that I can rotate it, and I'll rotate it about at least 1.5 turns. And the idea is that because these bearings only ever do maybe a 16th or a 32nd of a turn for their whole life, they're going to get worn in one spot, which means that as long as you rotate them to a different position than you found the bearing, you're going to be doing the right thing by rotating the bearing to a new fresh position, and that stops flat spots. Okay, so to rotate the bearing, that's actually a 700C inner tube that was dead. Needle nose pliers. I don't want to scratch this bearing, so I'm going to feed that into the bearing. Here we go. Put my needle nose pliers in, just rotate that randomly a couple of turns just to free it up. Make sure it's spinning free, which it is. Pull it out, and we'll do the next one. Second one, same bearing other side. I'm less worried about those shims now because I know which one they go on. So this is a bike, it's 2021. I'd say it's probably never had these bearings pulled apart in their life. I can still see some pretty fresh grease. There we go. Now I don't bother wearing gloves. I just wear clothes I don't care about My skip-in clothes, as my kids call them. Right, next bearing, these two here. Got to be a bit careful because this boom arm here, yeah, it's carbon, it's quite light, but it is supporting the rear derailleur, so I don't want to unscrew this and let the whole thing flop down. So I'm going to have to support that as it comes down. So when you pull this pin out here, there'll be two little shims. These are both identical, so you don't need to worry about which goes on the inside, which goes on the outside. So I'm just going to clean the bearing components. So just the shims, just using a crappy cloth, just to get all the dirt off and the grime and the grit. So you can feel that dirt mixed with grease and it turns into a bit of a valve paste. So you probably want to be doing this, I don't know what they recommend, but I'd be probably looking at doing this every 12 months. Probably depends on how grotty your local trails are. But, you know, if you ride in heavy rain, you're a bit of a dill. Just going to pop that out. And again, pretty dirty, pretty gritty. Give it a really thorough clean, inside and out. And then rotate it using the same technique I used before. So I'm just going to push that through. Just put some pliers in. Just rotate that around a few times. Make sure it's spinning freely, which this one is. Okay, now while I'm here, I'm going to do the other one. Now that only goes in one way, but make sure it's seated in properly. So I'm going to do this one. This takes one 8mm Allen key on this side, and you're going to need a second 8mm Allen key on the other side to hold it. Otherwise it is just going to, another 6mm on the other side to hold it. Otherwise it just sits there and spins like that. Oh, I can feel the dirt underneath that. There we go. One end off. So this will now just gently swing all the way clear. And here we go, parts are falling out. So I've got to store those and not mix them up with anything else. And you can see how filthy that is in there, so I'm going to give that a really, really good clean. So I am using my dodgy chook scratch map to line all the bearings out so I know where they go back. So the next one I'm going to do the Fox top shock. Now these ones are going to cop the least amount of crap, so I'm least worried about these, but it means I can get in and get behind these bearings here. That's one, and one on the other side. Alright, so pull that out, and that is not carbon fibre. It's probably the only aluminium part on the bike. And I'll give that a clean both sides. You can see the shim still sitting in there, one on the other side, and then I'll reassemble. Okay, so when you're pulling this bottom knuckle bracket apart, you'll see that the shim actually has a little ferrule, so it actually sits inside the bearing housing. So pull those both out and give it a clean, reassemble. So you can see a tiniest bit of grease on my finger there. Just putting a tiny bit on the little bearing sleeve, pop that in, and that feels beautiful spinning that around. So that is now ready to go in. Doesn't need a lot of grease. Okay, so I'm going to take the shock out now. So I've got a 5mm on one side, on the back. Oh, that is tight. Now that should just come out. There we go. So one beautiful Fox float valve. So you can see it's pretty dirty at the bottom. I'll give it a good clean the inside of the bushings as well and the bearings, and reinsert that. Right, so that's been really thoroughly cleaned. Bearing housing's been cleaned out. Just going to slide that back in. That kind of holds itself actually, and give these a clean. They're pretty good actually. Again, they don't get a lot of work. They don't get much rotation. So just going to clean the old grease out, reapply a bit of new, and remember the orientation, if you can, of which went in where. So the bigger one goes in this side, and the smaller one goes in the other side. Now I'm not going to do any of the torques up yet. So the torque, I'll get the torque wrench out, and all the torques will get done last. Now, time for the bearing. The bottom knuckle bracket. First I'm just going to apply a little bit of grease to the inside runners of these bearings. It's looking pretty good, don't need much. Just remember, when you're putting this main shaft through here, there's no actual bearing here, it's only basically relying on the shims. So I'm just going to put a tiny bit of grease on the inside of this of the shaft. I'm just going to lubricate the shim for the other side. So I'm going to put this big bearing through here. Got to rest that shim on my pinky so that when I slide the knuckle through, I've got to get the shim on the other side of the shaft. So it's just taking it, there we go. Beautiful. So that's how it's done. So the shim goes between the knuckle and the frame. And same on the other side. Okay, just a little bit of this good old Mobil GP grease. I'm sure I'm going to get shot down in flames for using the wrong grease, but I'm sure there's some special Norco grease you can use, but I don't have it. I did actually lubricate my derailleur the other day, and I did borrow some friends' special grease, which is special SRAM grease for specifically for derailleurs. So some things are important, some things are not. Refer to my cheat sheet about which one goes where. There we go, that one goes in there. And do the other side. Again, these are just sloppy. I'm just trying to get this suspension together. So I'm going to do the intermediate bearings now. Hope I can see. So just doing that intermediate bearing now. A little bit of grease. Put the shim on. Again, these shims are the same, so you don't need to, as in this, the same both sides. So you don't need to worry about depths. Okay. Critically, this has a shim on both sides, and it has a backing plate. So it screws up that back shim. Okay. Make sure this goes in the right way. It's all been greased up and thoroughly cleaned. Line that up, pop that in. Got to get the second shim, hold that in place, pop that through, and this piece goes on the outside with the flap, the little pointy bit facing in, like so. Status update. Shock's back in place. Haven't done that top bracket yet. This bearing is done, and this bearing is still to go. Putting the last bearing in, apart from the center pivot, and notice the fat shim goes on the inside, thin shim goes on the outside. So it might be easier just to use the grease to hold them in place. A bit of fiddling, but got it in there. Now to the other side. Lucky last. Got a T16 Torx bit, and I'm just going to go around and undo all of these, like so. Take the chain ring off, and then I can access this big mother of a bearing here. And you'll notice that it does actually have a great big lock nut here, so there's a fair bit of torque on that. Okay, so that only goes on one way, but it is an opportunity to give the chainring a clean as well. Now I can access, I swap the bike over and access that nut. Okay, to get this off, it's an 18mm socket, but you can't actually get a socket in there because you need to get an 8mm Allen key in there as well. So if you don't have a ring spanner, which I don't, I've got a 17 and a 19, you need to get a shifter, tighten that up, and then because it's lefty-loosey, the inner thread spins clockwise. I just don't want to scratch that. And then out she comes. Now you can see that I can't actually get that the center pivot out without removing the chainstay. So I'm going to mark it with a magic marker so I know the position it went in, and then I can rotate this out of the way and pull this pin out. Now that rotates out of the way, which is great, and I can get in there, pull this out. There we go, that just comes out now. It's going to support that, make sure the whole back thing doesn't pivot out and go crazy. There we go. Doesn't look too bad, feels a little bit gritty, and yes, there are spaces in there because they just went for a drive. Okay, so don't forget to give those bearings a really good clean and give them a rotation. Make sure they don't feel too gritty or crappy. Clean the dust seals around the outside as well. So everything's had a really good lube. I'm just going to swing that up into position. using the grease to hold those two shims in place. Get the shaft in my other hand. Sounds a bit sus, doesn't it? Make it feel like someone else is doing it. Oh yeah, slide that through. There we go, work that through. Perfect. Now the nut goes on the outside and we are done. Complete bearing clean. Okay, this is the bearing, the little seal nut, lock nut. Spin that up by hand. Now I'm going to do this torque first because once the chain guard is done back up, I won't be able to access that easily. Now you can see remnants on all of these screws here that hold the chainring on of little bits of blue Loctite. So I happen to have some 277 here, so I'm just going to put a tiny dab on each of these holes just so that my chainring doesn't loosen or come off. If you don't have Loctite, that's fine. Just check your torques, check those nuts. If you do take the chainring off, check them in 2 or 3 rides. Alright, very next step, or the very last step I should say, torque wrench, and use your cheat sheet, go down and adjust each of these to the correct torque. Okay, so this one for example, this is 8 Newton meters, and when it clicks, there we go, that's it. Righto, job done. So very, very happy with that. Bike is looking absolutely stunning, I've got to say. I've also taken the opportunity to give the chain a very, very solid clean because it was off the bike. So I normally don't do that if it's on the bike because I don't want to get any overspray onto the rotors. All of these torques have been done, so most of them are 5 Newton meters. The back is 10 Newton meters, and basically somewhere in between. All looking good. Oh yeah, i9 sounding good. Going on a mountain biking trip down to Beechworth and Yakandanda in a couple of weeks, so I want to make sure this is all tickety-boo. So very, very happy with that. Took, oh crikey, it's now 3 o'clock. I think I started this at about 10 o'clock, so it does take a long time, and you do need an Allen key, a shifter or a ring spanner, 18mm, and you do need a socket set, a torque wrench if you want to do this properly. So just be aware of that. For the right tools, torque wrench, Allen key, and 18mm ring spanner, and grease, and patience. And jump onto Norco's website and download, print this out, so you've got a copy of all of the settings and all of the torques for the whole back end. Thanks for watching.